ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me at the back? I said good evening. Just wanted to check what wasn't working, the mic or the manners. Many years ago, actually many years ago, I remember when I first learned what is the mission statement and the job description of an army officer, because there was this young lieutenant who had just come back, same, around about your age, maybe about 22, 23 years old. He'd come back from an operation in which there was actually active skirmish, there was a little bit of killing done, there was some wounded people. I mean, that's the kind of job the army is, not the art of living. So we have a little bit of casualties that we have. So this guy is sitting in the bar and he's introspective, he's morose, and his CO comes around and taps him on the back and says, "What the hell is going on? Why are you so upset? What's wrong?" He says, "Today I went into this operations and I kind of might have killed somebody and I don't know whether what I did was right or wrong, and I'm kind of thinking about that." So the CO tells him, "Here's the deal, guy. When you go into an operation, you go in with an objective of achieving a task that has been laid out for you, your job. Now what you did, whether the guy you killed, he was right, he was wrong, what he was doing was right or wrong, that is between him and his maker. Whenever they have that meeting, that judgment has to happen between him and his maker. Your job, as far as the Indian Army is concerned, is to make that meeting happen as soon as possible." So with that preamble, I want to start and giving you a different perspective. Because in our world, though the army is very highly disciplined and highly ordered, the structures are built very well, and you might say that the Indian Armed Forces is one of the most disciplined and the ordered organizations in the country that holds the country together. Remember one thing, that every job that we are sent to is full of chaos. Whether it's contact with the enemy, whether it's internal security, whether it's natural disasters, floods in Uttarakhand, Gujarat, earthquakes, child going inside a borewell, the Indian Army is sent over there and they do their job in the midst of all that chaos and they pull them out. The second element that you got to remember is that our troops are transient all the time. Our troops keep changing because, especially in special forces, in teams that are set together for a particular task, our troops constantly keep changing, and very often we work with troops whom we have never met before. When we are moving into one operation, another theater, we constantly keep changing our troops, but our mistakes are permanent. We don't have the luxury of coming back and saying, this quarter we lost a little bit of results, we'll make it up in the next quarter. It doesn't work that way. We make a widow in this quarter, she remains a widow for the rest of her life. Our mistakes come home in body bags. The fourth thing is that we have really no material incentive that we can offer to our troops. We have to take them into battle without ESOPs, pay hikes, employee of the month, any one of those jamborees that a lot of corporates and many of you will soon be offered as incentives to accomplish your mission. And we know from day one that no plan, no matter how carefully it is laid, no plan will survive the first contact with enemy. Because the moment you contact enemy, all your plans go for a 6. So in the next 15 odd minutes, I'm going to take you through an operation and show you what it is like to be in actual combat when you are taking troops into battle, into a situation which changes dramatically every second. And I'm going to use a battle that most of you would be familiar with. Let me start with this picture of this man. How many of you have seen this guy? Anyone? Matter of fact, most of you not only saw this man, but you saw his team operating for 72 hours. This was the team, the 51 Special Action Group, which was sent into Mumbai to sort out the terrorists who had hit our country about 7 years back. These 10 guys who were sent in. Now let me explain this to you a little bit. So before I get into the actual operations, you have to understand what the NSG is like. The NSG consists of two distinct arms. There is the Special Action Group and the Special Ranger Group. The Special Ranger Group is consisting of paramilitary forces, and these are the people who provide protection to the VIPs, and these are the people you usually see in TV, around important people and around politicians and stuff like that. The Special Action Group is a much smaller team, and this team is drawn completely from the army and usually commanded by Special Forces officers, and this is actually the sharp end of the stick. On 26/11, 7 years ago, on a Wednesday evening, it was this team which was put on hot standby as soon as the terrorist attack in Mumbai started. Now I want you to visualize, put yourself in the shoes of this commanding officer, because only then you understand what real chaos is. So this man had taken over the unit literally 90 days before the operation was called for, which means that, and by the way, those of you who don't know, the NSG is a deputationist force, which means that the troops and the officers are rotated every 3 years. That essentially means at any given point of time, you will hardly know about 30 to 40% of your troops because they are getting rotated and you are getting rotated. This man is put on hot standby and he's told that you have to take your troops into combat, and he takes his team who is already on high alert, and then 14 hours later, they are deployed into the mission. Just to put that in context, imagine you had to give a major presentation, a make or break, life-changing presentation, and you were told that the presentation would start at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then told 9:15, 9:25, 9:35, 10:50. Nobody's telling you can go away and come back at 4 o'clock. They keep you on standby for literally every second, and 14 hours later, you're launched into the mission. When you're launched into the mission, you're told it's not one mission, it's not two missions, it's 3 missions that have to be accomplished simultaneously with no way of lowering the importance of any one mission. The NSG is designed to operate one mission at a time. And the first squadron of the troops, 220 soldiers who reached Mumbai, who loaded their equipment, unloaded it in Palam, loaded it back into the aircraft, unloaded it back in Mumbai, loaded it back into the BEST buses, unloaded it back in front of the operational areas, were then divided into 3 different teams, and 3 different teams had to operate simultaneously with the command and control structure, equipment list, manifest, all the communication, all SOPs and processes designed for one mission at a time. When these 3 missions were launched, if you add up all the special forces rescue attempts, you add up every 0 dark 30 backward to the last 3 decades, they don't total up to more than 1,000 rooms that these boys had to open one after another after another. And let me put that again in context. In room opening drills, there are 2 ways you do it. One way is called a hostile room opening, and that usually happens in certain areas when you know for sure that is the enemy inside, it's the bad guys inside. You must have seen this in movies. There's a bunch of guys who line up, they put a explosive charge, the charge goes up, they toss a grenade inside, the grenade goes off, they put the MP5, they lose one magazine, and then they enter the room. You can't do that in Taj, Oberoi or Chabad, because there, in every room, you could have a terrorist, in every room, you could have a tourist, and in every room, you could have a terrorist with a tourist. So every room has to be entered with the room opening drill, the alertness, the caution, the degree of difficulty, the carefulness, each and every aspect as the room before, and the one before, and the one before, and the one before, and the one before, more than 1,000 times. All of this was done in 72 hours flat. And many of you may not know this, but after the NSG took over, after your Black Cats took over, there wasn't a single collateral casualty in 2611. Not a single person died, apart from the 2 commandos who lost their lives. And by the way, when our troops entered into Taj and Oberoi, they are not usually, now of course they are trained to go there, but usually our troops don't go to 5-star hotels. For some strange reason, they don't normally frequent 5-star hotels. So they were trying to figure out virtually everything on the fly. They were trying to figure out how to open the lifts, how to open the doors. They didn't know whether these walls were bulletproof or bullets could come through them. They had no idea whether the AC ducting could take the weight of a person. They had no layout, no maps. They had nothing that was available to them. Incidentally, all of these floor plan maps, all these diagrams were available in the Brihan Mumbai headquarters just about 100 meters away, but they were not available to the soldiers who were getting in, figuring out what to do, entering room by room, one room after another room, one after another after another. And just in case you thought there were 220 guys doing this job, this 220 consists of the sniper squad, the dog squad, bomb disposal. So the actual guys who are entering the rooms are just about 70-80 people. And each one of these 70-80 people, after they enter a room and clear it, that particular floor has to be left with 2 more soldiers guarding it, because you can't have a situation when you move up that one of the terrorists comes down and manages to escape you and enters a floor below you. So as these troops are going up, as these teams are going up, at every stage they are shedding troops. And by the time they reach the roof or the final places where they found the terrorists and they hold them up, they were just reduced to a handful of people. And all of these people who were doing this job, 14 hours of standby, 72 hours, no sleep, no food, no water. They were managing with whatever they could find in the hotel. They were picking up apples and they were drinking the water that was available there. And yet, each one of these troopers, and by the way, these soldiers, we don't import them from Denmark or Germany and all of that. I mean, they are from the same villages and same places from where all of you come. They're from the hinterland of this country. And they are led by the officers who are not very much older than you guys. It's about the same age, 26, 27. The lieutenants, the captains, and the majors are the cutting edge of our army, like any army of the world. And they finish their mission, and they go back home. And you don't even know who this guy is. So I want to share with you some principles that we teach to young officers. We were taught as young officers that when you go into battle, what are the principles that you need to know and you need to use to thrive in chaos. The first principle is that every soldier of yours under your command must know the commander's intent, because they must know how to assume orders when there are no orders. And that's what happened in 2611. That happens in every operation, that when you hit the enemy, suddenly the situation changes. That's not the time to be giving fresh instructions and fresh orders. It'll never work that way. Therefore, every soldier in your team, every team member in your team must know what is the strategic intent. And that is what made it possible for the Black Cats to be able to immediately disperse into 3 different teams and get new leaders to take on the tasks that their commanding officer was supposed to direct them to do. The second rule is that every leader should be capable of doing one up, which means that they should be trained as you should be. You should be training yourself to be able to command one level up. So a section commander who commands 10 men is taught how to command a platoon of 40 men. A platoon commander who commands 40 is taught how to command a company of 180. A company commander to a battalion commander to a brigade commander, and so on and so forth. The third rule is that you focus on your core drills and battle procedures until they become muscle memory, until they become second nature to you. I remember we had a boxing instructor in the academy. Any boxers here? So this boxing instructor, he would make us train for about 4 hours, 5 hours continuously. And after we could not lift our arms up anymore, he would make us go down, put our finger down on the ground and go around that finger 20 times. You know what happens when you do that, right? What happens? You become completely giddy. You become tired when you go back. You don't need a drink. It works just the same way. It's actually called IMA whiskey, Indian Military Academy whiskey. So they make you do that. They make you put your finger down, go around 20 times, and you get up and you're in this daze, and then he'd make you punch the punching bag 20 times, 20 times. Go back again 20 times, again up 20, again down, again up, again down, again up. And we had no clue why the hell he would make us do this kind of stuff until we went into the boxing ring, and the first punch that the opponent hit us, and our head went like that, and the opponent is standing pretty, thinking I'm knocked out of this guy, and suddenly this guy who was supposed to be dizzy comes back with 20 punches, because that becomes muscle memory. So whenever you get into a battle situation, it is your muscle memory that will serve you well, and that is why our job as instructors in the army, as indeed your job as leaders should be, to make your troops sweat in peace, sweat in peace, sweat in peace, so that they don't bleed in war. The fourth element is improvisation and innovation on the fly. And nobody does it better than people whose survival is at stake. There are countless examples, even in 2611, how troops had to constantly keep innovating, keep figuring out new drills. Let me give you a couple of examples. So the typical drill when you enter a room inside which a stun grenade has been tossed. So a stun grenade is like a grenade, except it just stuns you, it doesn't kill you. It's meant to be used in a hostage situation where you throw the grenade inside a room, the explosion goes off, all the people who are not trained in military, military warfare, they will all be down and they will be, sort of not comatose, they will not be able to move. But people who have been trained, they will know how to avoid a stun grenade. They'll go into the fetal position, they'll hold their ears, prevent the ear canals from bursting, and they will be able to get up. What was happening in Taj and Oberoi was guests were frightened and they were hiding inside the bathrooms, inside the bathtubs. And so even after a grenade would go inside, a stun grenade would explode, they would still be in a daze and they would start walking out. And the commandos had, at that point of time, to take snap judgments to decide whether to shoot or not. And as the track record shows, with not a single collateral casualty, this is considered to be a textbook operation which more than 25 countries of the world, special forces of the world, came to learn how this job was done. Another example, those of you who remember the Taj would remember that the Taj has nothing facing it. So you cannot dominate it from the sea. And yet you needed to dominate it from outside because you had to put suppressive fire on the terrorists to prevent them from interfering with the evacuation operations that were going on. Because first the NSG was tasked to remove every civilian out of the game before they started going after the bad guys. Now, at that moment, you couldn't really get a covering fire from any one of the buildings because bang opposite the Taj is nothing but the sea. On that instant, on that day, the commandos improvised by using the fire brigade's lifts, and they put up mobile perches which had snipers sitting on them, and these perches were moving around in front of the Taj, providing suppressive fire from outside to make sure that the terrorists could not interfere in the evacuation operations. Leaders must always be out there in the front lines. Leadership, ladies and gentlemen, is a contact sport. You can't play it sitting on Excel and mobiles or apps. It doesn't work that way. In combat leadership, the leaders have to be out there. And that's because in the fog of war, there will be fleeting opportunities. There will be those instants of opportunities where leaders have to take a decision right now, right there and there. They can't wait for McKinsey to come and advise them or look at Gartner's 4 quadrants and figure out what to do. They have to take those command decisions there and then. And that probably is epitomized by the officer to men casualty ratio that your army has, which is incidentally one of the highest in the world. The Indian Army has one of the highest ratios of officers to men casualty, which means that our officers lead from the front. Even in 2611, the 2 casualties that happened, 1 officer, 1 non-commissioned officer, which means 50% of the casualties were officers. I want to leave you with this one sentence that we would always tell our young officers. We would tell them that good leaders love chaos, because it's only in chaos that the core drills, your courage, the attitude, the chutzpah, the can-do attitude, all of that comes to fore. The plans, the structures, the schemes, the processes, they're a good guideline. They tell you general line of direction, that this is the way you are headed. But it's only in chaos that you can find those fleeting opportunities, you can find those holes, you can find those passages, you can find those initiatives that you can take there and then, which will enable you to deliver each time again and again and again, as indeed the Indian Army has done for every mission that has ever been given to them. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Thank you, thank you.